Access to the recording after the session. I'll send out a link probably by the end of the day. Meeting session is now being recorded. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. And as Pacific Union agents, you are the first group to take part in our real estate certification program. We hope this series inspires you to become a member of our organization by visiting californiapreservation.org. Today's session will look at more than 150 years of architectural styles in San Francisco. Each speaker will roughly proceed in chronological and stylistic order. We will follow that with a rapid quiz session where you will test your knowledge of architectural styles for 9 examples. This quiz session is completely ungraded. It's just for your personal enjoyment. But if anybody misses today's presentation, they will have access to a separate quiz that will allow them to pass part 2 of the series. Today's format will consist of 2 presentations, together totaling more than an hour in length. We will close with a 15-minute ungraded quiz session, as I mentioned, and then followed by a question and answer period. You may be pulled from time to time. Don't be alarmed if it covers your screen. It will only briefly appear during pulling and then disappear when the presentation resumes. There is also a chat box, which is visible to all participants. If you would like to comment or interject, you may do so through the chat box. If you are connected on a mobile device using the Adobe Connect mobile app, certain interactive features may not be available to you, but you should still be able to watch and listen to the presentation. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time in the presentation. This will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type it in the chat box. I am now going to introduce today's speakers. Caitlin Harvey is an architectural historian with a background in practical preservation methods, as well as historical research and writing. After completing a master's degree in historic preservation at the University of Oregon, she has spent the last 9 years taking the lead on a wide variety of projects, which have included 12 major historic resource surveys and historic context statements, 4 successful National Register nominations, and numerous historic American Building Survey projects, federal tax credit applications, Section 106 assessments, EIR cultural resources components, and historic resource evaluations. In 2010, Ms. Harvey established Left Coast Architectural History and has continued to focus on providing quality historic resources consulting in California. Left Coast Architectural History provides historic resource and preservation consultation for individual clients as well as project support for environmental, architectural, and historic resources consulting firms. Ms. Harvey's recent work has ranged from an isolated cabin site in Sequoia National Park to the urban streets of San Francisco's Bayview district. As a 4th-generation Californian, she feels a deep personal connection to the history of the state. Coming from a family of architects and interior designers, and with an undergraduate degree in art history, Ms. Harvey has a strong background in history, art, and architecture that she directs with great enthusiasm toward her ongoing work. Jonathan Lammers has over 15 years of experience researching and documenting cultural resources. He served as the lead researcher and writer for the Benicia, Pacific Grove, Pebble Beach, and Elk Grove citywide historic context statements, as well as the Central Soma historic context statement for the city of San Francisco. He has documented buildings, districts, and landscapes for large-scale historic resource surveys, including the Market in Octavia, south of Market, and Mission District surveys in San Francisco, as well as the Richmond Prism Historic Survey. He currently prepares historic resource evaluation responses in support of current planning efforts, and also prepares individual landmark nominations as part of San Francisco's Landmark Designation Work Program. Without further ado, we will now begin the presentation with Jonathan.
There we go. Uh, as John said, I first want to thank John and CPF for inviting me to participate in this program. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I really do love working in San Francisco because it has a spectacular collection of buildings that's really is unlike anywhere else in the world. Um, I'm going to focus today on architectural styles that you're most likely to see in this city. I don't think there's any way I could cover every different permutation, but I'm really hoping that we can sort of learn the major styles of the 19th and early 20th century. So I'm going to leap right in. We'll talk a little bit more about the goals. As I said, I want to be able to understand the general chronological sweep of styles in the city and also where they're most likely to be found. And by the end of this, I'm hoping you'll be able to make educated guesses about a building's age based on its style and location. And one of the big ones I also want to work on today is learning the difference between Victorian and Edwardian and what that means architecturally. So one thing I want to really just make clear is that even people who've been working in this field for a long time use different names to describe similarly styled buildings. There's no perfect name. It's just, we try and lump them together. And sometimes we talk about buildings as having one influence or a mixture of influences. So I want to get away from the idea that there's such a thing as a pure style. Styles don't appear and disappear. They're part of a continuum. So buildings with blended influences are more common than anything else. And I also want to point out that San Francisco is really unique. Although you see these same styles elsewhere in the country, the fact that we had these narrow 25-foot wide lots and that we were using primarily redwood and Douglas fir to build the houses means that the things here are really different as compared with the rest of the country. Now, one of the things that I called this presentation is the Wooden City, because San Francisco, as it developed, really was built primarily out of wood, at least the residential buildings. It doesn't mean they didn't have brick and masonry things here, but much of the city really was wooden. And part of that, what I find unique is that what they did here, they're attempting to copy masonry buildings like you might see in London or New York or Boston or other major cities, but we were doing it out of wood. So on the left you see a group of brownstones in Brooklyn, and on the right we see some buildings from a similar era here in San Francisco. So one side we have masonry, one side wood, and that's one of the things that makes San Francisco special. Now, I mentioned earlier about, learning where to find older buildings in San Francisco, and the Victorian San Francisco is really a halo around the area that burned during the 1906 fire. So if you look in the upper right and you see the red area, that's the extent of the fires that burned after the 1906 earthquake. So everything there, with a couple exceptions, is built after 1906. So just to the edge of that is where we find our Victorian buildings. This doesn't mean they can't be found elsewhere in the city. The area I've highlighted in yellow is just the areas where they're most likely to be found. So we're talking about the Mission District, Noe Valley, Castro, Hayes Valley, Haight-Ashbury, the Western Addition, Pacific Heights, Cow Hollow, and so on. So the first style I'm going to start with is this is one of those catch-all terms. People use different terms for it, but the one I like the best is national style, which really reflects the fact that this was something that was built all across the country. It's a sort of simple gable roof form, and I'm going to use the pointing here. Gable roof just means this sort of shape. And this was used all across the country, as I said, and it was used in San Francisco as the city was developing. This was a simple, easy type of building to erect. And one of the things you note about it is it has that front-facing gable roof. On the best preserved examples, you might see a front porch. And like all Victorians, it's deeply recessed on its lot. Now, there's not a ton of these in San Francisco, but there's certainly, they're not uncommon. They're just scattered around. And when you see them, they were built as early as immediately after the gold rush, but um, typically the ones that you would see today were likely built during the 1860s or perhaps during the early 1870s. This was such a simple form to build that they built it quite a long time. You tend to see them in the Mission, you see them in Telegraph Hill, in the Western Addition, and there's also examples in the Bayview. Here's another example of the building. You can see I'm going to use the pointer. A little addition has been done over here for a garage. Something else you see with Victorian buildings in San Francisco, at least the better preserved examples, are these site walls. You see this out by the street, and it's usually topped by some iron fencing. That was just a convention. During the Victorian era, you set your buildings back so you could have a little postage stamp front yard. Later on, buildings are going to be built right out to the lot line, and that's also going to be accompanied by a change in architectural styles. This is a building that's in the Mission District. It was built in 1866. And here I wanted to show you, this one has actually been altered. They've changed the windows out and put asbestos shingles on, but you can still see that it's really, really a simple building, and you can also see that it's set back on its lot and has that intact site wall with the fencing on top. So here's the Tanforan cottages. These are both from the early 1850s, and these also, you could also talk about these as an example of the next style we're going to talk about, which is, excuse me, I was going to say flat front Italianate, but actually my next slide is Gothic Revival style. Forgive me. This is the house in the Western Addition off Divisadero. It's one of the oldest houses in the city. It was built about 1851. Gothic Revival style is actually pretty uncommon in San Francisco, except for churches. One of the things that really sets these buildings off is decoration up here in these little gable ends usually. These call them barge boards or verge boards, and they usually have this sort of scroll cut ornamentation in them. That's one of the things that really sets them off, is really indicative of the style. Also pointed arch windows, but again, you tend to see those more in church architecture, and these are, as I said, pretty rare in San Francisco. But where you do find them, again, Telegraph Hill, Mission District, Western Addition, and churches throughout the city. Here you can see the pointed arch windows that I'm talking about, which is you see a lot in church architecture. But in domestic architecture, you might see something, just this little decorated barge board here. This is a little house that's probably only about 800 square feet out in the Mission District. Very simple, just like the National style which preceded it, but the main difference is that we have these decorated barge boards. Here's another fairly unusual one, but I really like it. Again, this is in sort of the Mission District, Noe Valley border. Got this lovely curving decoration here in the gable end. You can see we've had an addition that's been made here at the side later on, and we've also got something that's going to really characterize San Francisco from the 1860s into, well, really up until about after World War II, and that's the bay window. And here's another little example. This is also out in the Mission District, and you'll notice we have this little decorated cut barge board. Often these early houses are very small. These were easily built, and in some cases they might actually be moved. A lot of people are surprised to find that San Francisco had a really vibrant house moving industry for decades, so that if an owner owned a little house like this and came into some money and wanted to build a bigger house, they might put it on the back of the lot, or they might sell it to somebody who would hire a person to jack it up, put it on, get a bunch of horses and pull it to a lot somewhere else. So this next style I want to talk about, the flat front Italianate style. This is, as you saw in one of the first slides when I talked about San Francisco sort of copying the masonry buildings of big cities in the East. Flat front Italianate style is really a prime example of that. And as you can see, this is really just an evolution of the National style. The thing is that the gable roof is now hiding behind this flat front parapet. We're putting this nice cornice roof line on to make it look fancy, but really it's kind of the same building. We're just hiding the roof form now. Also, this style was built quite a bit by builder developers, so it was built in tracts. What you're looking at here is a portion of the Liberty Hill Historic District, and as you can see, these were pretty cookie cutter when they were built, and in many ways the Victorian era was tract housing, same as you see later on. These were people who would build 20 or 30 of the same buildings at a time, and that's why you often see these grouped where you find them on the city. So like other Victorians, they're recessed on their lots. And one of the things that sets off Italianate buildings are these hoods over the windows. We just call them window hoods, and they're usually bracketed. And that's something you see often on these buildings. And also the type of siding is rustic channel siding. You can see it here on the side. You see that on the secondary elevations of most buildings in San Francisco, but you also see it here on the front of these buildings, and that's something else that will shift over time. This is a really widely distributed style. You can find them in many neighborhoods of the city. Again, you see some list of common suspects: Mission, Hayes Valley, Noe Valley. You also see a few in Bernal and in the Potrero, and of course Western Addition and Pack Heights. I'm just going to keep scrolling through some examples. This is on Hampshire Street out in the Mission. These could be single-family homes. They could also be duplexes or just townhomes. In this case, these are all multifamily. Here we have 2 entries on the ground floor and 2 entries on the ground floor, but in this case you have one above the other. These are both common sorts of configurations. And there's just another variation on the theme. What makes this one a little bit unusual, but not terribly, is at the cornice here we have a little pent roof here at the top rather than a straight rigid line, but we still have the window hoods and a little hood over the entries. Here's another example. The window hoods are just a little bit, we have now a little arched tympanum on the top. And something else you see a lot with flat front Italianates is a tabbed parapet up here, this sort of middle center tab. And that gets used a lot as well. That's usually a good indication of age. Even if you see one that's been altered, you can usually make a guess. So following on that theme, it begins to get a little bit more elaborate. We have what's the bay window Italianate style, and this is something that I think most of you recognize from your travels around San Francisco. This is sort of classic Victorian San Francisco. Again, we have the gable roof is hidden behind this parapet up here, and you have typically these are 2 stories in height. There's some 1 stories, but they're almost always 2 stories, and they have a full height bay window. You have a entry portico frequently with some nice classical details around it. Here's the entry portico. Windows are often arched, not always, but often, and they're divided on the better examples by colonnettes. And colonnettes are these little slender columns you see here that are divided the windows. And on good examples, you also see quoins at the building edge. Quoins are these little blocks over here that they've applied, and what they're doing is they're just trying to imitate masonry. They're trying to look like stonework, but they're just nailing on blocks of wood. So let's take a look at some examples. This is an early one. It's again, this is out in the Mission District. Some of the early ones, they just had the bay window on the first floor instead of the second floor. These are fairly rare, and when you see them, they're typically a little bit older, maybe around, say, late 1860s into the mid 1870s. Here are ones that are combining. We've got sort of the old flat front example, but over here we've got the bay window on the secondary facade. This is a pretty elaborate example with some really nice trim here on the, I don't want to really call them window hoods, but we've still got a lot of ornamental work around the window. This is in Pacific Heights, these 2 buildings. Here's a nice group where you get to see a flat front Italianate next to some bay window Italianates. Here you can see the quoins at the corner, and all we've really done, the difference between these 2 buildings, is we've added a bay window here, and then we've put up a more prominent cornice. And again, I just want to point out, here's that site wall along the front. The buildings are set back. That's always a very good clue to age. Sometimes these buildings were built as row houses. This is all the same building, but it was obviously meant to be sold to 3 different buyers, or you can tell that they've been painted differently, reflecting a different ownership. And this one here over on the left has been stripped a little bit of its ornament, but you can still tell that this was all one building built at the same time. This is in the Lower Haight. It's actually on Haight Street, not far from Fillmore. And again, as we saw with the flat fronts, these were developed by builder developers. They were built in mass, so these went up particularly during the Silver Rush of the 1860s. A lot of people, everybody knows about the gold rush, but the silver rush of the 1860s was actually brought more wealth into the city, and you really start seeing these being built at that time and then widely through the 1870s. If you see a building like this on the street and you wanted to make a quick guess about its age, you'd say 1875 plus or minus, and that'd probably be a pretty good guess. And here's some more. This is in Pacific Heights. These are some very fine examples. These two have a very nice, the portico entry, nice classical column. They've actually got a little balustrade on top with some finials. These were, the previous example was more middle class. These would be more upper class examples. So the next major style, and again, this is one that's probably very familiar to you all, is what's called the stick Eastlake style. And this one starts to come into popularity during the early 1880s, really peaks right about 1889, 1890, and then tapers off during the 1890s. I sort of associate this one with the explosion of streetcars in San Francisco, or cable cars. During the 1880s, a company named the Market Street Railway started developing new lines throughout many parts of the city, and these were the buildings that were very frequently put up along those new lines. The big difference with these versus the Italian 8s is we have a boxed bay window. Instead of an angled bay window, we've boxed it out. Now the name stick also refers to the ornamentation because they like to use a lot of stick work, and stick work is just long brackets. They use these long corner boards. It's, a profusion of milled woodwork. And that's also something to keep in mind, is that, during this period, San Francisco had all sorts of planing mills across the city where you could order a bewildering array of different woodwork and combine it in different ways on buildings. So going through box bay windows, elongated brackets and corner boards, bands of linear trim. Two-story examples, this hip roof, false front parapet. This is a little hip roof. And I also see a lot of sunburst, triangular pediments, things like that. And now let's look through some examples. Here's a group. This is on Valencia Street near 23rd in the Mission District. It's all stick Eastlake, but we can see that it's being accentuated in different ways. Here we have some of those triangular pediments on the buildings. And then this building is a really, really spectacular example of the stick style. We see these long bands of trim. We see this sort of checkerboarding up here. We've got fan ornaments up above the windows. This is really quite a tour de force for stick Eastlake. If you wonder about the Eastlake name, that's actually stick. Stick refers to the woodwork. Eastlake started out as a furniture style, as a way of furnishing your home, but the sort of patterns they used ended up going on the woodwork for these buildings, and so we call them stick or Eastlake, or just combine it as stick Eastlake. Here's a building that actually has what we call classic stick work up here in the gable end. You can see this little truss. Again, we have an classical entry portico on these. So in some ways they're very similar to the bay window Italian 8s, but they also are easy to distinguish because of that boxed bay window. And here's some others that have some unusual stick work. You can tell these were done by the same builder, likely at the exact same time. This one may have originally had a portico. You can see this one may have just been stripped off at some time in the past. Here's a group, again in the Mission District. I like these because they have some unusual windows on them, little sort of multiple divided lights. And this whole block was actually developed in 1889 by a single developer and a single architect by the name of Thomas Welsh. Here's some stick buildings in the Lower Haight. I believe these are actually along Haight Street. These are some really spectacular examples with a profusion of millwork on them. You also see sort of humble examples. They were used not just for residential buildings, but also for corner stores and all types of commercial buildings. There's another grouping. I think this is sort of Haight-Ashbury area, Lower Haight, that transition. As I said, where you see these, you tend to see a lot of them, and again, they were next to the developing streetcar lines at the time. This is a grouping on Cap Street near 24th. One of the things I like about this grouping is they still have a little bit of ironwork. This was probably on a lot of Victorian buildings throughout San Francisco. But in World War One, they had huge scrap drives to get metal for the war effort, and this was ripped off a lot of buildings. A lot of better examples also had it up here along the roof line. It's called cresting, but you see that very seldomly in San Francisco. A lot of that went into the scrap drives. These were all done by a single builder by the name of John Coop, but you'll see over this building it actually was jacked up later on, and they inserted a business here on the ground floor, and if you look up here you can actually see the original entry for the house that's been turned into a window. So there's a lot of different things happen to these Victorian buildings over time. Here's an example of a duplex Sticky's Lake building. A lot of variations, but it's that box bay. We've got the long corner boards here, and again, sort of stickwork patterning in the spandrel panels on the bay window. Another really common variation on Sticky's Lake buildings are these cottages, one story over raised basement. You can see these also had site walls, but a lot of cases they've been cut away to insert garage entries for them. And these are, you see these commonly, parts of the Mission. You also see a lot in Noe Valley. And that's because those areas were more working class. These were fairly inexpensive homes when they were built and generally had working class or lower middle class occupants. Here's another example of some stick cottages. And again, you see here's a variation where we see that same sort of entry above entry that we saw earlier with some of the flat front Italianates. Again, I just want to have the idea that it's a continuum. This is a grouping I wanted to point out. You see we have a Sticky's Lake cottage here. These were all built by the same builder at the same time, but I find this one fascinating because during the 1920s, I think a stucco salesman came through and convinced a bunch of people to modernize their buildings or make them into the Mission Revival style. So all these buildings originally look like this one, but they've been sort of altered en masse so that only the one here still has some of its original details on it. This is a sort of a transitional. I would still call this stick East Lake because we've got these long brackets, but we're going to start transitioning some of these details, particularly these sunbursts. You're going to start seeing them on what's called the Queen Anne style. Forgive me, that last one was meant to write transitional. And again, here's another one that's starting to transition. You see this sort of big gable pediment at the end. We've got the long brackets at Sticky's Lake, but this is definitely a building in transition. These are ones, this is more classical stick building, and these are more foreshadowing the next style, which is really going to take off during the 1890s. Same thing, these are sort of transitional ones I want to point out. You've got this prominent gable end. This one is an unusual building, pattern shingle work up here. These are all buildings that are getting ready to transition to what's next. And this is what's next, the Queen Anne style. I'm sure most of you recognize these buildings. It's Alamo Square, built in, I believe, 1894. The Queen Anne style is really sort of the height of the Victorian era. This is where you're going to get more ornamentation really than any other Victorian style. Usually these buildings are also asymmetrical. All kinds of pattern shingles and gable ends. You have porches that have spindlework and often front-facing gable roofs. This is really the as I said, the blow-off of the Victorian era, if you will. At the time, they often called this the picturesque style. You can find them virtually anywhere you find Victorians in the city. You really see a ton in Haight-Ashbury, Dubois Triangle, Castro area, and again, Mission, Pacific Heights, and parts of Excelsior, Richmond, and the Bayview. There are three main variations. There's a Queen Anne corner tower house. There's the ones like we saw in Alamo Square, which is with a front-facing gable, and then you have these one-story cottages. The variation is that these two tend to be more upper class, built for wealthier clients, and these are built for more working class residents, the cottages. Here's an example. I believe this is out in the Haight where you see a corner tower house, and then if you take the tower off the buildings, you get the rest of them marching down the street. And as with previous eras, these are following the streetcars as they go out. A lot of them, as Golden Gate Park, um, started to take shape during the 1880s, and then in the 1890s, people could see it was going to be a really nice place to go. A lot of streetcar lines were built to go out to the park, and that's why you see this style particularly well represented in the Haight in the Western Addition area. There's another example. I believe this is actually on Haight Street. These are in Haight-Ashbury. I like these. These are called the Seasons, people call them. I'm not sure who the builder is, but you can see this one has an example of a giant snowflake on it. I've been told by people these are meant to be, spring, summer, winter, fall. One of them has a corner tower here, so does this one. But these are really profusely ornamented, all sorts of trim work here above the windows. Great buildings. Here's another tower house, and this roof line here is sort of blending with something we're going to talk about a little bit, is the shingle style. You see this sort of curved eaves bent out on them. That's something that's characteristic of another style that's coming into play during this time. Another Queen Anne, very typical. I'm sure you see these all over the city. More examples of Queen Anne houses. This is an unusual one with this sort of bow front bay window. And this one you can see all the patterned shingle work that's going into it. That's really indicative of the style. This is in Noe Valley, Castro sort of border. I believe these were all built by a builder by the name of Fernando Nelson, who was really active in that area. And he just did, some variations on a theme. It's all the same building, but he did, something a little bit different in the gable ends of each one. Here's another example. Spindle work is this sort of turned element you see above porches. That's a really common element of this time. And again, fish scale shingle work is something else you see a lot with Queen Anne houses. There's another little grouping all in a row. This one here has obviously been stripped. One of the things that really sticks out for these buildings is that they really understood proportion. These spandrel panels here that they put beneath the windows, when you take them out, suddenly the proportions look very awkward on the building. There's some more. This is in the Mission District. Really love this one with this sort of comma here and this brilliant spindle work. And some more here. See a two-story example and then sort of the cottage example. 1.5 story on the right. And some more. These are sort of, I call these late Queen Anne because this is getting towards the turn of the century. And what you notice here is that we're seeing like a little bit less ornamentation on them. We're not seeing, the fish scale shingles up here. There's not a lot of work in the spandrel panels. They're getting sort of a cleaner look. And that's something that happened right around the turn of the century. The profuse ornamentation of the Victorian age was falling from favor, and so this is actually an attempt to go with a little bit more of a modern, clean look. Here's a little cottage. This one we've still got the shingles up here, but it's just, rustic channel wood siding. There's not a lot of ornamentation going on, and this was obviously built for a sort of working class buyer. Here's some other ones that are right on the edge, turn of the century. Again, they're still doing some, there's some nice ornamentation up here, but we're starting to use tongue and groove wood siding a little bit more, and there's just not quite as much gingerbread on these buildings. So when I talked earlier about the Victorian era versus the Edwardian era, both of them refer to periods of the British monarchy. So the Victorian era is the reign of Queen Victoria, who reigned up until 1900. And when she died, her son Edward took over the throne, and he reigned until 1910. So they call that early 20th century, 1900 and 1910 period, the Edwardian era. And so this is sort of what we're transitioning to during this period. Again, here's some of that late Queen Anne. See, it's just getting simplified. We still got the gable front roof. We still have bay windows, but it's just getting overall much simpler. Here's a little cottage. This is out in the Richmond district. So I love this building. One of the ways, this is one that's really on the cusp. We've got a corner tower over here on the edge, which you associate with the Queen Anne era. But if you get rid of that tower, you really have what's going to be sort of the hallmark of the Edwardian era. And again, I would suspect this building is built right around the turn of the century. And that brings us into another style, which is really just a local interpretation of classical revival, but so many people call it Edwardian, and I think it's fair to call that. I mean, when I say that, this is to colleagues and to other people, they understand because they know these buildings. They started coming online 1902, 1903 is when you start seeing them, but you really see them after the 1906 earthquake. This is the style that everywhere in the burn district, this is what they built after the earthquake, and it's why you see it so commonly in many parts of the city. Usually they are flats or apartments. They almost always have bay windows, with angle and curved being the most common. You really get a nice accentuated cornice. That's not really different than earlier areas. You had cornices too, but they're really prominent on the Edwardian buildings. And also the cladding. We've gone from the rustic wood channel siding on the Italianates and the patterned shingle work on the Queen Anne's, and now we're seeing sort of tongue and groove or flush wood siding on the Edwardian buildings. Now, this style remained popular after Edward died in 1910, and it continued to be super popular up until about 1915. And then afterwards, we have the same buildings, but the big difference is we switch over from wood cladding to stucco cladding, and that really does happen right about 1915. There's a pretty clean break. Again, you can find them everywhere in the burn districts and outside that area as well. Really common: Telegraph Hill, Nob Hill, Russian Hill, parts of the Mission, and also you find these on the back alleys in Soma. A lot of these photos I'm showing here are slopes of Nob Hill or Telegraph Hill. And this is going to give you some idea of the variations. Again, here's that flush wood siding, very prominent cornice. This is a very high-styled example, probably built right around the turn of the century. This was obviously built for a wealthier owner than some. And they're very consistent. These were, when these were going up, San Francisco thought they were really, perfectly appropriate response. These were seen as very clean and modern and dignified when they went up, and a nice antidote to the Victorian excess. You see these used a lot also for corner commercial stores, mixed-use buildings. There's a nice one you see at Vallejo and Montgomery, taking in the view there with those bay windows. This one is, you'll see we've got a rounded bay window, but we've also got a square bay window on either side of it. Again, very typical of the era. Here's a mixture of a rounded bay window and then some angled bay windows. Here are two side by side. I like this. This building at Wright is very much like the examples we're talking about, but this one is also a contemporary of it, probably built right around the same time. There's a little store down here on the first floor. It's also got this red clay tile roof, which is anticipating some later styles that Caitlin's going to talk about. But again, these two buildings from the same era, that flush wood siding, simple classical details. Another grouping of buildings marching down the street. You see these a lot. If you want to take a guess when you see one of these buildings, remember they were built a lot after the earthquake. So if you're inside the burn district area, you can usually make a guess and say, oh, that was built in 1909, and you're probably going to be right. You're going to be very close. Might be 1907, might be 1911, but you're going to be pretty close if you just say 1909. That's a really good guess for buildings like this. Here's an apartment building, a pretty large example. Here, no rounded bay windows. They're all boxed, but you can still see that flush wood cladding, and it's just cleaner looking, more modern than the early examples. Another example is these were built side by side, probably around the same time, 1909, plus or minus. Here's an example where they really, really accentuate the cornice. You see these different places in San Francisco. They're not super common, But when you see this shape, also you can guess that that's Edwardian era. And here's another one. This is right near 24th and Jersey in Noe Valley. And here's some more. These are all mixed-use buildings, big line of storefronts going down the street, and with the owners or renters living above. I did want to talk very briefly about one. Sorry, I see a question coming in. Any major differences that stand out in the interiors with these different styles? Yes, for sure. During the Victorian era, houses tended to be more compartmentalized, and so you typically had a parlor when you came in, and then a succession of parlors, which could be used as bedrooms, or they might be a music room, or a sitting room, or a library. So, you know, it's sort of by today's standards, if you walk in, they would feel very cut up, but you don't see that very often because most people have done interior remodels. You know, if you see a house that still has its formal parlors and such, that's pretty rare these days. Edwardian era, most of us have been inside these buildings. We may have lived inside these buildings, and they tend to be more open on the whole. The finishes are not quite as ornate, although you still usually have baseboards and some maybe some crown molding or molding up at the top, but they are overall definitely cleaner and more open on the interior. These are Romeo flats. I want to talk about them briefly because they're a subset of the Edwardian era, and they're called Romeo flats because they have this internal stairwell and then you have a landing as you come up, and this is a little balcony here so that so you can do Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou? These actually were banned under the building code after a few years, but they were built briefly. These were usually always multi-unit, meant for working class residents. You've got a unit here, 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 and here. So 4-unit, 6-unit building. Small railroad type flats where you walk back from room to room in succession. Here's another example of a Romeo flat, although this one is a little bit more upscale because we've got this great colonnade running down here. It's on Harrison Street in the Mission District near 24th. Why were they banned? They were seen as, because the units were sort of small, they went up in Telegraph Hill. There was a example called the Cuneo Flats, which people railed against because it was tenement housing, you're rebuilding with tenement housing, and these buildings were seen as sort of being on the edge of being tenement. It wasn't that they were inherently unsafe, it's that people associated that design with really strong multifamily housing, with crowding a bunch of people into a building. I see them as fairly efficient, but it was a social sort of campaign. Oops. Looks like I repeated a slide there. Now, I'm going to go back in time a little bit. This style is not as common throughout the city. What we've done is the sweep of the most common styles through 1915, but I want to talk about some other ones that were going on at the same time, but they're a little bit more limited to where they are in the city. One of those is the First Bay tradition, also called a variant of the shingle style. We call it First Bay tradition because it's really a local interpretation of the shingle style back east, and it was promoted by architects, Bernard Maybeck, Julia Morgan, others. They're combining elements of arts and crafts and what would come to be known as the craftsman style, but it's unified by the shingle work. And so here we have the things you can pick out. It's eclectic. It's a catch-all. I said that experts disagree on names. You could say, oh, it's kind of got Queen Anne massing, but it's shingle style. It's kind of craftsman-y. And you'll see those examples as we go through. Now, these are frequently designed by architects. You often have bay windows, and you sometimes get art glass or unusual windows in them. These are typically upscale, and so you're only going to find them in sort of certain areas of the city, and they're most common Pacific Heights, Presidio Heights, Cow Hollow, which are all sort of the same thing. They run into each other, and parts of Russian Hill. You just don't see these with any frequency elsewhere in the city. Here's another shingle building. It's sort of got a Dutch colonial revival gambrel roof here, but it's also, this is what we just call English, First Bay tradition style. And I think it's better to say First Bay tradition than shingle, because you're really, when you say First Bay tradition, you really are referring to a sort of local interpretation of the style. And there's also a Second Bay tradition that Caitlin's going to be talking about. These examples are more what I'd say, closer to that pure style. If I'm talking about, these are buildings you saw elsewhere in the United States frequently. This gable end with these flared eaves here, and then we've got this eyebrow window, sort of this, this surface. Sometimes it's a more curved, wavy surface. These are getting closer to what you'd think of as a classic shingle building, but these are actually fairly uncommon in the city. And I'm looking over at the comments here. I'm seeing that these people are pretty good at picking out where the buildings are. Good example. Yeah, a lot of these that you're looking at, I pulled out of Pack Heights, Presidio Heights, and Cow Hollow, because that's where they live. Here's another example. I think this one may actually be right along in Presidio Heights, right along the edge of the Presidio. Another example. As you see, there's a lot of variations on them, but unified by that shingle cladding. This one you could say it's got, a little bit of classical revival or colonial revival with this very elaborate gable end, but otherwise, First Bay tradition. Here's another one where we're using, a Queen Anne sort of tower, but again, the shingle cladding. And these started being built 1890s is where you see them, but a little bit, if I had to pick again, most common age, I'd say 1905. Right in there would be a good guess. I mean, certainly afterwards, but right there, turn of the century is when these are most popular. Here we see one where we've got a mixture of cladding. We've got this nice brick down here, and then the shingles up top. Another example. As I said, I just want to point out there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of stylistic blending in terms of massing. Again, you got a corner tower, which you might think of Queen Anne. This sort of blocky massing is a little bit like colonial revival, but we're going to call it First Bay tradition. And here's another one in that vein. I think these houses are familiar to a lot of us, and again, there's no pure name for it, so you can just say First Bay tradition. Here's some other examples, pretty spectacular ones. Here we're starting to see some elements of I mentioned that arts and crafts was a influence on this style. Some of the things you see in out-and-out craftsman style, you also see used here, in that sort of exposed rafter tails, exposed beam ends, things like that. And we'll see more of that in a moment. Another really nice example. And here's again, this is a sort of roof line that you're really going to see with the craftsman style, but we've got the shingle cladding, and so we'll call it First Bay tradition as our catch-all. And that's a nice transition to bring us into the craftsman style. Most of us are used to seeing these as bungalows, classic bungalows like you see in Berkeley and in Oakland. We don't have a lot of the bungalows in San Francisco, again, because of that 25-foot wide lot, so you tend to see them with a more vertical orientation here, and usually the key for these is the exposed rafter tails here at the roof line, and then these knee braces up here in the gable ends. Other things you see commonly is the use of clinker brick chimneys and walls, and also windows with divided upper sashes. If you see here, it's usually several lights in the upper part of the window, and then just one light in the bottom. Clinker brick, if you're curious about that, is if you think of the Armory building that's at 14th Street and Mission, that big, imposing, huge brick building with sort of the raw on it. Clinker brick is just sort of like brick that was broken up in the firing, and architects liked it because they thought it had a artistic look, if you will. Aged the building a little bit, gave it solidity. Craftsman is not really common in the city. You see it scattered throughout, usually on the edge of slightly older development. And I also want to point out that this style doesn't die at 1915 are just die with end of wood. Actually, stucco clad examples are more common than those clad with wood, and you see them in certain residential parks in San Francisco, and I think Caitlin will talk about that. Best wood clad examples that you'll see are out in Ingleside Terraces, and these are ones that are really sort of the classic craftsman bungalow. Here's clinker brick, as I was talking about. So these sort of rough brick pieces. Here's some little examples. This is actually in the Excelsior. All of these, I believe, were originally clad with wood. A couple of them have been stuccoed since, but this is a nice example of a builder-developer coming along and doing a couple in a row. This style is much more, I'm looking again at the questions, much more common single family than multifamily. So whereas Edwardian was most commonly multifamily, First Bay tradition or shingle style and craftsman style much more likely to be single family. That said, here's an example of multifamily buildings. This is actually on Folsom Street in the Mission District. Kind of unusual building. Don't see a lot of these, but again, it's an example of the style. If you want to take a guess when these were built, good guess is, say, 1912, right in there, usually plus or minus, maybe a few years afterwards, but I'd say 1912 is a very good guess. And thank you, Mr. Bartlett. He's saying clinker is brick that blew up when being baked or not perfect. And here's I believe this is Ingleside Terraces, just a bungalow. There's that clinker brick again. And this is maybe one of the best examples in Ingleside Terraces. Really spectacular. And here's sort of a little simpler example. In some ways, if you look at this, I talk about styles blending. If you think back to the late Queen Anne examples I was talking about with the, being just simple, still have that gable front design. This fits right in. That's essentially the same design, but now we've just put some knee braces up here. We've put some exposed rafter tails over the bay window. Essentially the same building. We have an edge of a Queen Anne here. You can see the roof line is very similar. It's just being articulated differently. And here's some more craftsman buildings. Again, pretty sure this is Ingleside Terraces. Another style that was not as common in San Francisco, but was also happening around the turn of the century, was the Colonial Revival style. Colonial Revival is just that. People were interested in the country's early history, and so you had buildings that attempted to pull some of the stylistic influences from those early buildings, and a lot of those are classical influences. We see here this nice big classical column and these dentils across the top. It's not that they didn't use those with other styles, but there's a little bit more of that formality. If you think about a banking temple. Banks were often built to imitate, the classical buildings in Greece. Give that idea of solidity and being really old and reliable. And that was seen as, very appropriate for the United States when it was a young country to copy that sort of thing. And then there's a revival in it around the turn of the century. I wrote up here, I said 1920 is sort of the end. In a way, that's not really true. It stayed popular through the 1950s, but it looked a little bit different. So I'm going to sort of focus on that turn of the century look. Dormer windows are something else that's really common with this sort of four-square design. And in fact, if you took the details off this and made it more simpler, Caitlin and Ryan might refer to it as just four-square, which is a simplified version of this. Hip roofs are also very common with this style. And again, I want to point out, like Craftsman, examples clad with stucco or brick are as common as those clad with wood. They are also really just found in a few areas in the city, and again, it's out that Pack Heights, Presidio Heights, Cow Hollow. They're scattered elsewhere in the Western Addition. It's not that you can't find them anywhere in the city, but those, these neighborhoods are really where they live in the city. And there's another example of this sort of formal entry. Hip roof, dormer window. We have these sort of columns or pilasters, I should saw them. Column is freestanding, a pilaster is just when it's sort of integrated with the wall surface. Here's a little grouping of them. This is, I believe, in Presidio Heights. And some more. Now, frankly, if you put wood shingles on some of these, you could we'd go back and call them First Bay traditions. So I just want to say, you've got the same sort of form, but we give it a different name, just depending sometimes on the cladding and arrangement. And this would be sort of a classical colonial revival, particularly this entry with the balustrade over the top, very formal. The dormer windows, the sort of four-square massing of the building. But we still have to have our bay window, because after all, we're on the bay. Another example, this is something you actually might see anywhere in the Bay Area, Berkeley, Oakland, any city where buildings were being built at the turn of the century. You can find these, and again, that's getting towards that sort of four-square design. Another one, a little bit simpler, but here we are. We're covered with shingles. Is it shingle style? Well, is it First Bay tradition, or is it colonial revival? Well, you might say it's got influences of both, as they were being built at the same time. And here's a very formal example that is getting a new garage insertion over here beneath the bay window. Here we have sort of the bow front bay window that you see with our Edwardian buildings, but classical entry, the dormer windows. This is a really high-styled example. I noticed a question from Kevin, what's four-square design or massing? I'll come back. Four-square just means that really a box, a building that's built like a box, and they're very common. So buildings that look like this are what we might call four-square. I'm calling it colonial revival because we've got the dormer window and some columns here at the entry. But if somebody called this four-square design, I wouldn't necessarily argue with them. So we'll come back to those. And again, here's another one where dormer window, we've got a classical entry, but we've got shingle cladding. Is it First Bay tradition? Is it colonial revival? It's kind of a little bit of both. So I just want you to feel comfortable, that these styles are a blend of influences. What is a hip roof? A hip roof is I see a question on the chat line. Here's a hip roof. It's going to be triangular or pyramidal on its sides, and the ridge line is going to kind of start in the middle. And I'm sorry, it's easier to see from the air. Let me go back and see if I can pick out another one. You've got this line here, and then the sides have got the same sort of thing, and then a ridge line runs, down in the back, and then you have this same thing on the back of the house. The back of the house looks the same as the front. So it's, a gable roof is something that comes up to a point like that. Hip roof is a little bit lower slung and has this sort of aspect on all four sides. Here's an example that actually doesn't have a hip roof. This is actually a gable roof design, which is not as common, but it's good to point out the exceptions to the rule. But here, a sort of classical entry. We've got our big pilasters at the side, and this is out on, you see, corner of Jordan, and this is the Jordan Terrace area, which actually has quite a few of these. And here's another sort of subset of colonial revival. They just call this Dutch colonial revival because of this gable roof. These got built in New York, where a lot of Dutch people were living. They have this sort of roof form, and it was also used, but these are not common in San Francisco. But when you see it and you say, hey, that's Dutch colonial revival, and you can guess, early 20th century is usually a very good guess for these buildings. 1905, right in there, 1910, good guesses. Okay, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I want to thank very much. If there's any other questions before I hand it off to Caitlin, I'm happy to talk a little bit more. Sorry, I'm just about to hand it off. Anything else on the chat line? Okay. Thank you all very, very much. Again, it was good to be here, and now I'm going to hand it off to Caitlin.
All right.
Okay, Caitlin, we're ready.
Okay, great. So I'm going to transition here into what we're calling the stucco city. And I think it's important to note that although it's the stucco city, it's still essentially the wooden city. Most things in San Francisco are built of wood. And stucco really, when it came into being, or I mean, it's been around for a long time, but when it became popular in the 19 teens and 20s, it really allowed people who are building in wood to mimic the look of masonry, brick or stone or whatever they were going for. Kind of in the same way that the wood Jonathan talked about early on was mimicking like brownstones in New York and things. So you're going for that effect of permanence and grandeur, but you're still building of essentially the native materials we had around here. And I think it's important to note too that, like Jonathan said, you'll find versions of the things he talked about that are covered in stucco. And it's important probably to kind of try and figure out were these transitional buildings that were built in an earlier style but with the new technology of stucco, or have they been altered somehow? And you'll find both, and it's often hard to tell unless you look at permits whether something has been reclad in stucco and was originally shingle or woodlap. So you'll get those crossovers. But most of the styles I'll talk about today are more modern and were originally designed and commonly built with stucco cladding. And I think I'll kind of note that a lot of what I'm going to talk about you'll find throughout San Francisco. Jonathan was really good about telling you what neighborhoods you might find things in, and I can do that a bit too. But because these are essentially newer, more modern styles, you're going to find them throughout the city and often built as infill within older portions of the city. So you'll find them in between Italianates or Queen Anne's or things like that. So my first slide, we'll talk about Mission Revival. And again, we're moving into the revival styles. People were interested in historic aesthetics and coming up with buildings that mimicked historic styles but had a modern twist on them. So, this was trying to evoke early California, the Spanish period, mission buildings. So stucco lent itself very well to kind of mimicking adobe. So a lot of these buildings you'll find have stucco cladding, heavily textured, that makes the walls look very substantial, even though, again, they're built with wood framing. I think the most hallmark aspect of Mission Revival buildings are these shaped parapets, and you'll often find these little pierced elements too. If you think of a lot of the missions up and down California, think of those big, flat, campanile bell tower type things that had bells in them. You won't really find that in these houses, but they're kind of trying to mimic those bell tower effects. You'll get a lot of heavy projecting wood beams and the red clay tile roofs. Because these have parapets, they'll typically have a flat roof, but you'll get a lot of these little what are called pent roofs that kind of stick out from the sides of from the facade and also cap off bay windows. And you'll also find a lot of arches and arcades, again mimicking those sweeping verandas of the Mission era. Here's some more examples. There's, again, throughout the city, I think if you think of the Presidio and a lot of the buildings that are there, they aren't necessarily residential buildings, but those are definitely Mission style. And then it's found a lot in, the Richmond and the Sunset and even Pacific Heights. Here's an example of one that doesn't have the pierced parapet, but it does have that very iconic bell shape. You're going to find, as you'll see in my later styles, other examples of styles that have parapets, but none of them are going to be these really emphatic curved shapes like you see here. So this kind of moves into, I don't think I have as many examples as Jonathan did, but possibly it's because these more modern styles are less represented within the city. But Sorry, where are the buildings on the left?
That was on the
I
previous slide.
Right, right. I actually pulled a lot of these pictures from the internet, so I'm not exactly sure where they are. I think these are in Nob Hill somewhere, actually. I think I've seen them. Um, so this is moving into Spanish colonial revival. Again, we're looking at, trying to evoke early California, which was a very romanticized period. People really idealized it. Um, and I think Spanish colonial revival, though, is a little less ecclesiastic mission style and more of a refined hacienda look. So although you're still going to have the stucco cladding trying to appear like adobe and your clay tile roofs, you're going to have arches and arcades also, but you're going to have these what I call chiriguresque, which is a pretty large term, um, but it simply means more refined, ornate sculptural ornamentation. So in this example, you've got these turned and sculpted mullions between windows. You have wall panels. You have these little medallions that are applied places. Turned kind of spindle work, shaped portions of stucco where the stucco has been molded. And if you can even see over the door here, there's like a little balconette with a very ornate corbelled base. And the other thing you're going to find is colorful tile, which has a very Spanish aesthetic. Um, There's some other examples of that first one was kind of a row house, but these are down in St. Francis Wood and they're more sprawling. There's more, they broke out of that 25-foot wide lot, so you're able to get the more asymmetrical forms and things. And again, here's the arcades. You'll typically have low-pitched, mostly gable roofs, some hipped roofs like you see over here, but very low-pitched or even flat with some like clay tile coping around the edges. These big substantial chimneys, those even have arches there, so they're kind of reflecting that motif again. And this one down in the corner I thought was interesting because it even has this wood balcony, which kind of reflects on the Monterey colonial style, which was very specific to California and the Monterey region. But it became popular again as these revival styles were brought around. And so you'll again get like wood beaming and railings and elements like that. Um, Someone's recognizing the addresses and things. A lot of these I did pull from historic resource evaluations that I've done, so I feel like if I was familiar with them, I could speak about them better. But and then we go into Mediterranean revival, and again, they're all very similar. They're all stucco with red clay tile roofing, but there's these small elements that can really kind of pull them out as one style or the other. With the Mission, it's the parapets. With the Spanish colonial, it's the refined detailing, and with Mediterranean revival, it's fine detailing, but in a different sense. These are applied plaster ornaments. You'll get them mostly in kind of garland-like forms, or you'll find these medallions or shield motifs. And as far as I understand, they're very mass-produced items that, like the Victorian jigsaw gingerbread work, you could order them from a catalog and stick them on your house. And I thought one thing interesting to point out about Mediterranean revival style and some of the later associated styles is that in San Francisco, with the very restrictive lot dimensions, you get this very typical facade organization where you would have a garage on the ground floor. We were getting into the age of automobiles, so you had to have a place to store your car. And you'd either have the entrance in a recessed vestibule to one side, or it would be on the more living level and approached by stairs that went up. And then you'd have either a very central bay window or a pair of bay windows. This is a three-story example, so there's actually more higher up, but thought I'd present. I also wanted to present kind of like low style and high style examples. So, the one on the left is kind of your typical Richmond special. Um, you have this is one with the garage on the bottom, the recessed or the elevated entry set off to the side, and the central bay window. This kind of has an arched parapet here, but I wouldn't consider it the bell shape of the mission style. And you do have these little applied tiles, which are kind of Mediterranean-like. And this one's a little more elaborate. It has an example of the first story entrance that's recessed in a vestibule next to the garage, and then this really broad bay window, and it has a lot of the applied little details in plaster. So, again, you could call this one on the left mission, I suppose. It's all up for debate, but many are similar, and there's just little things that set them off as being one style or another. Then we move into French Provincial, which I actually kind of consider a sub-style or parallel style to Mediterranean Revival. Again, it's evoking the style and aesthetics of a Mediterranean region. Jonathan didn't really talk about Second Empire style earlier, but that was a much earlier French-inspired style that had mansard roofs and was very ornate. This is not quite that way. I would imagine the French countryside and chateaus and things like that influencing this style. So again, you're going to have that same, in a lot of cases, that same facade organization with the garage on the ground floor, a bay window above, an entrance to one side. This one is not quite typical, but it works. So you've also got stucco cladding, but instead of a flat roof or any parapets, you're going to have this very steeply pitched hip roof typically. It's not quite a mansard, but it's got that French flavor to it, and often they will have dormers sticking out of them. And I would say the ornament on this is much less ornate. You're not going to find the applied plaster medallions and things like that, but you are going to find coining to kind of evoke that rustic stonework effect, and decorative shutters are often very common also. Here's a few more examples. Again, on the left is kind of a low style example out in the Richmond district. Again, with the shutters, the very minimal trim, but it kind of evokes masonry, especially with that keystone there, and then the steeply pitched roof. This one is more elaborate, obviously, and I will note that they are not all pink. French Provincial comes in other colors too, but this has it actually has like the classical cornice here, which is interesting, but again, the coining and the dormers. Okay, so Tudor Revival. This is in Presidio Terrace. You can see the big church. It's not a church. It's a synagogue in the background. So Tudor Revival is interesting because it really spans a huge kind of collection of substyles. And I would say anything that reminds you of medieval England falls under Tudor Revival. So it can be anything from a small English cottage to something that looks like a fairy tale castle. But its kind of hallmark in a lot of cases is this half timbering. It's kind of this gridwork of wood pieces that are flush with the stucco or even brick, what's called nogging in between the half timbering, and you can even get these kind of quatrefoil design effects going on. It's very striking. But you'll get that. I would say any building that has that is Tudor Revival, but not all Tudor Revival buildings have that. So it's a hallmark of the style, but you're not always going to find it. There's other ways to define the style as well. What you will see is a combination of materials. So you'll get brick veneer, you'll get stucco, you'll get wood, half timbering, you'll sometimes get stone or stone effect cladding. You're always going to have very steep, well, I suppose except in the castle version, you're going to get steep roofs. And these will often have really interesting effects. You can see this one here has kind of wrapped eaves. They'll have slate cladding sometimes, or sometimes composition shingle, but they're trying to achieve that look of thatch, which I have seen on some buildings in the United States, but it's really not common. It's a huge maintenance problem. So, but they're trying to get that look of the fairy tale cottage with the wrapped eaves and steeply pitched roofs that are often asymmetrical as well. A lot of them, sometimes you'll see a very like ski slope swoop, and those are kind of the substyle is called Norman farmhouse, which is actually French, I suppose, but I would classify it within the Tudor family. Windows will be smallish, typically casement configuration, and they'll have very small panes. Sometimes it'll even be leaded glass, and sometimes you'll find like diamond pattern panes, which is really cool. You're also going to have very irregular plans and facades, so no symmetry. You have lots of gable forms intersecting and little dormers popping out. So I was able to find two examples that kind of show the breadth of the style. On the left is what I would term more of the castellated version, and on the right is the English cottage. So you've even got the crenellated battlements here, definitely with the coining going more for a stone look, and the brick. You can see the little diamond patterns here in the leaded glass. And then on this one, it's much simpler, but the half timbering, I'd say more refined details that are common to the style are very prominent chimneys. Sometimes you'll even see them with very ornately decorated caps on them. So they'll go up and split into individual mini stacks with, diaper work, which is crossed brickwork, or they'll have like a spiral form to them, so they can get pretty ornate in the chimneys. I talked about the rolled eaves and then also the eyebrow window, which I wish I had an example of it, but again, it relates to the thatch effect and the way that, a window would pop up under thatching. So you'd have this little like bell-shaped curve as the dormer. You'll find Tudor arches, which are a kind of depressed, squashed down version of a pointed arch. You'll have jetties or overhangs, which you can kind of see one here. It's where an upper story kind of overhangs the first story, and it was supported by beams. And again, lots of whimsical details. And this moves into the prairie style, which is not very common in San Francisco, and I think it does relate a lot to, Jonathan was talking about it under the Colonial Revival example, but the Foursquare effect. And someone earlier was asking about what defines that, and I would say it's definitely where you see a facade that you can divide into four squares, essentially. Often there will be a porch or a central doorway, but you'll have a window on each side and two windows above. And it often really relates to the interior plan as well. You'll walk in, there'll be a central hallway, but then there'll be a room on either side and two rooms behind that. So you'll have, four square on the front and then four square flat as well. And it creates this real boxy effect. But in the prairie version, this was kind of related to Frank Lloyd Wright and the Chicago School and building out in the Midwest where there was lots of space and you had sweeping, very horizontal forms. So, like I said, not very common to SF because you're gonna, you have the restrictive lots in most cases. They're typically 2 stories and then might have 1-story porches or wings poking out of the sides. Very low-pitched hip roofs, and I think the best hallmark of the style are these really broad eaves, often with exposed rafter tails. So I like to think of the prairie being very flat, and so these buildings are very flat and horizontal. You'll have very massive square posts supporting porches and very wide chimneys. Also just kind of evoking that very staunch form. I only had one example of that, I think, because they're hard to find. And then we're moving into Art Deco. So things that I've talked about previously were mostly revival styles and people being interested in historic aesthetics and trying to revive those. But at a certain point in the 20s and 30s, they wanted to create something completely new. So we went into the modernist styles. And I think the first of those is Art Deco. And this looks like nothing we've ever seen before. It's not a revival of anything, although it did tend to use Egyptian motifs or South American motifs because the key to it was geometry and stylization. So I would say with Deco, remember vertical. So everything about Deco is vertical and reaching for the sky or pointing at the sky. You're going to have vertical lines, you're going to have these chevrons, you're going to have kind of radiating sunburst-like elements that all kind of point upwards. And these buildings will all have pretty boxy forms with flat roofs. But like you can see here, there'll be parapet forms that point upwards. There are some rounded like floral motifs here, but again, it's not very naturalistic. It's very stylized, and everything is about being a circle or a triangle or a square. So here's a more modest example on the left. It really just has these kind of piers here that are very vertical and have these stepped tops. I think that kind of relates to the idea of ziggurats or South American temples that had those stepped things. So they like to evoke those kind of motifs. And then zigzag trim work was also very common. And over here, this is a funny example I found because, you know, it looks kind of Spanish colonial over here, but it has this bay window that definitely has the Deco chevrons on it and zigzags. And I'm not sure. I assume that's original, but it could be an alteration, I suppose. Hard to say. And of course, paralleling Deco, but slightly later, was Art Moderne, or what we call Streamline Moderne. And this was really an outgrowth of the popularity of transportation and travel. Automobiles were becoming popular and easily accessible in private ownership. Trains, planes, ships, all sorts of things like that were becoming very in vogue. So they even tried to evoke those forms in architecture. Like Art Deco, you're going to have very boxy forms with flat roofs. But in this case, instead of going vertical, we're going horizontal. So you have these very horizontal elements that are called speed lines. Typically, speed lines are kind of incised or very flat, but you'll also get these projecting kind of box cornices. Corners are rounded instead of squared, so you get that airflow effect. And those particularly lend themselves to glass block windows because they could wrap around corners. So you get a lot of those. And then in the next slide, you can see that we even have portal windows. So you've got kind of a ship-like thing going on. And I think that's also reflected in like metal railings that you'll see around balconies. So it looks like something you'd pull off a ship. Got rounded canopies here, even the rounded entrance. So very, very round. Anything that air would flow around well would be Art Moderne. The international style gets really, really modern, and I would say it's not real typical. It's very high style as well. You're not going to find it in your more modest examples of houses. You're going to have profuse glazing, usually with metal sash windows, and they're going to be found in banks and ribbons where they're all just interconnected and creating big glass walls, flat roofs, boxy forms, smooth unornamented surfaces. And in this case, this is a Neutra building actually, so it's definitely a high style architect design, but there's not even any stucco on this. This looks like metal sheeting of some sort. And you're going to get cantilevered areas that kind of project out. And if they are supported at all, it will be by very thin poles. So they wanted that kind of lighter than air effect. I don't know if you can think of the Farnsworth House. That's pretty much a glass block that's on stilts. Kind of trying to look at making it levitate above the ground. Here's a few more examples. I guess this is kind of this is in Presidio Heights, a more modest example, but again, you've got, I like to think of rectangular facade division in terms of international style. So anytime you have a facade, like the facade's going to be a rectangle, and then you're going to have a rectangle, and a rectangle, kind of creating these block effects, like a Mondrian painting, maybe, without the color. And then this is a more high style example, but with those ribbons of windows. They can be very plain, but they can also have some really interesting architectural forms. And then we move into the Second Bay tradition, which is one I've had a lot of experience with lately. These you're definitely not going to find commonly through the city, but they're going to be in neighborhoods where infill has occurred or on really challenging lots to build on. And one of the hallmarks of the style is that it responds to its topography. So, you know, really steep hillside lots where it would have been difficult to build on in earlier years, you might find someone come in and build a Second Bay tradition house. Jonathan talked about First Bay tradition earlier. Second Bay tradition is related, but not visually, I would say. It's simply because it's an outgrowth of more regional influences, and so this actually kind of grew out of early rustic ranch houses. As you'll note, it started in the 30s, so it kind of grew out of the Depression, and so the use of really simple detailing and almost cheap materials occurs, and so in a lot of cases, I've had people, you know, kind of point out that, oh, this building isn't, you know, it's not quality, but it's not about the materials, it's more about the aesthetics and the theory behind the design. So again, you'll have usually horizontal wood siding and banks of windows horizontally, flat roofs. Sometimes they'll have wide overhangs, sometimes not. There's often an associated carport, I've found. And you'll find plans, like I said, that are split levels to adapt to the hillside sites, or they will have these kind of crazy angled plans where there'll be like a second story that's totally offset from the first. So they're kind of interesting. And these, although they appear cheap or simple, were definitely architect designs. So you'll find names like Worcester and Henry Hill and Dinwiddie. Those were all architects who were very specific to the Bay Area and created this style based on their experience of kind of rustic California architecture and then applying modernist theories to it. So here's some other examples. That one, the one I just showed, was a Henry Hill. I think this one on the top is also Henry Hill, and the one at the bottom here is a Worcester. I think the Worcester one really illustrates an interesting aspect too, that this was coming out of, it was coming out of the Depression. It was throughout World War II. There was a sense that the world was becoming very chaotic and your home should be your sanctuary. And so a lot of these houses really kind of turned their focus away from the street. And although it has a very nice street presence, you're not going to find a lot of windows facing the street in a lot of cases because they would almost turn inward or towards the back of the property. The one I worked on recently actually was up on Twin Peaks, and it totally faced out towards the city. You can't even barely see it from the street. So although no one can really witness the architectural styling, it's there, it's just facing away from the public realm. So that's kind of an interesting social aspect of that style. And then mid-century modern, it's a little bit of a catch-all for many of these things that were built from about the 30s to the 70s, but I think there's a definite class of house that can be called mid-century modern that was built between the 40s and the 60s. So post World War II. I think with a lot of these, I forgot to mention, but you know, the automobile is the private family automobile is becoming all the rage. So garages are original to these houses, unlike Victorians where they might have been added in, and they're definitely prominent and put right out there in front, so everyone can see how many cars you have. Um, Mid-century modern is pretty simple. It has a lot of the elements of other things I've talked about, international and whatnot, but um, I don't know if dumbed down is an appropriate thing to say, but they're simplified and more directed at the common man, maybe the GI returning from war, wanting to buy a house for his family. They'll have boxy forms, cladding again. Sometimes they'll have panels of wood or stucco, or sorry, brick, like you see here. They'll have asymmetrical facades with a lot of articulation, planes coming in and out, and picture windows. I think you'll find that most, as these styles progress, you're going to get more large expanses of glass with either like picture windows or just single light sashes that don't have all the little muttons dividing them up. These examples, this one is the one I was thinking of that has the horizontal wood paneling. And that even kind of throws back to the streamline thing of having this horizontal effect. But and this one shows these kind of framing elements of the walls. So again, you're concentrating on the block and the square and having very kind of facades divided up into grids. I threw minimal traditional in here. I think it's one to point out. It used very traditional American forms. So if you think of that iconic child's drawing of a house with 4 windows and a gable, you're always going to have these gable elements. And I think that's one of the most indicative elements are these gables that have no eaves. You're also going to have minimal ornament, but you're going to have, things like scalloped trim and decorative shutters, just things that are very kind of quaint and traditional, but applied to these more modern boxy forms. And here's some more examples. This one's really pretty plain. And this one even has these kind of eave returns, which are somewhat Greek Revival, casting back to that. You'll get little flower boxes with trim and, the things that you would think of in the 50s. And then the ranch house, which is definitely not common in San Francisco because of its sprawling plan that definitely would not fit on most lots, but it's going to be long, low, have 1 story. Again, you're going to have the very prominent garage or carport at one end. Typically wide porches, often recessed. You're going to have simple kind of rustic supports. And you'll sometimes even in really or examples, you'll get like wagon wheel motifs or roosters cut into the shutters, things that'll remind you of being on a ranch. So you can imagine someone sitting out here with his mug of coffee while the cows run past. I think this one I wanted to point out too. If you look at this window on the front, it's a little small to see, but it's a big window, but it has muttons that divide it up, and there's a real horizontal emphasis to those. That's a very mid-century kind of indicator. I don't know, it's hard to describe, but you can see how it's different than the regular grid you see here. So often when you have horizontal muttons in your windows, you can really call at least the window out to being very mid-century. And I think that's the end because I can't go any farther.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. I'm going to suggest, since we're at 11:35 right now, anybody that needs to leave is more than welcome to. We'll continue to go through the rapid quiz, which shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. So if you'd like to stay and test your knowledge, you're more than welcome to. I'm going to pull up the first question. And everybody will see the results once voting is complete. Okay, so it looks like most people have voted, and I'm going to broadcast the results right now. Most people are indicating that it's Edwardian and Italianate, which I believe is the correct answer, isn't it?
Yeah, that's I chose this one for the quiz because I thought it was an interesting crossover. You've got the corning at the building corners, which you would have seen during the Victorian era, but you've also got the flushwood siding that you see more in typical of the Edwardian era. So this is a post-earthquake building. It's actually on 16th Street, just a few doors down from Guerrero. Probably built about 1908.
Okay, on to the next question. And there's a good mix of answers here. It looks like some people are saying Edwardian, some are saying Stick and Eastlake. I think you intentionally chose this one because of its difficulty, right, Jonathan?
Well, it's just one that's I tried to bring ones that weren't necessarily the easy examples. This one again, this is Edwardian era. This is right after the earthquake. You have a formal sort of entry on it, so I'm going to pull up the little arrow here. But the thing that sets it off as Edwardian, and also you have colonnettes, which you could kind of call those out from being Italian era. But it's the sort of clean, overall clean look, this strong cornice, and again the flush wood siding is usually a really good, this tongue and groove wood siding like you'd put on your floor, except they use it as cladding. That's a really, really good tip off for the Edwardian era.
On to the next one. And this one seems pretty unanimous. I think we probably made this question too easy. So shall we move on to the next one? Or did you want to say anything in relation to it?
No, I think everybody that it's just like the name implies. We have the window hoods there and the flat front.
All right, on to the next. Okay, so there's a decent mix between mid-century and Second Bay tradition. Did you want to comment on this, Caitlin?
Yeah, this is Second Bay region, but I wanted to throw it in there because there are, mid-century modern and Second Bay tradition are very similar, but this was designed by Henry Hill, who was a renowned Second Bay region architect. So, if it's, they're very similar form-wise, but the fact that it was architect designed by one of these designers who was part of the Second Bay region school really throws it into the Second Bay region category. It also has the offset second story, as you can see. It's very like angular plan, which I think could be one of the biggest indicators between them is that mid-century modern is always going to be very block-like, and all the stories are going to line up, whereas Second Bay tradition can have these kind of offset, wacky angles going on.
Okay, next one. And again, a good mix between two responses, the Mediterranean revival and the Mission revival.
Yeah, well, and that's part of the reason I wanted to throw this in is because it is a little confusing. I would categorize it as Mediterranean simply because it doesn't have that really big central curved parapet. But Mediterranean will also have parapets. They'll just be a little less grandiose, and often you'll get these tabbed-like um, effects going on. But otherwise, it could be Mission with its stucco cladding and clay tile roof, and so it could be a toss-up.
And this one is pretty much in the stick in the East Lake camp, it seems.
Looks like this one is again brought in as an example. There are some elements in this that you could relate to stick. I mean, you've got these long boards coming down here, but the Italianate is this is probably from 1875. This is like a bay window Italianate. The difference is you've got this little sort of gable aspect of the roof here, which isn't common. But what I wanted to point out is the arched windows and these slender colonnettes on it, sort of a little intermediate cornice or entablature here dividing the bay windows. You want to say that this is an Italianate building. It's just not a usual form.
Great. Okay, on to the next one. Most people are saying Mediterranean revival here. Um, Anybody like to comment on this?
I'd say this is a stump the experts kind of one.
I
This
was
is
gonna say
the
Jonathan picked this photo, so I don't know if it's Mediterranean revival, but
I didn't assign any style to it. I think everybody who chose Mediterranean Revival, I think that would be fair, certainly for the one here on the far left, if for no other reason than we've got the clay tile roof. But here we don't have that at all. These are all built by the same developer. They're mid 20s. They're of the right era. This is in the Marina District, though. Frankly, the ones in the center and on the right, you could say it's a blend of influences, but this was an example to say that sometimes it is no style. It's a vernacular work of the 1920s in San Francisco that's combining, different elements.
And again, this looks like most people are saying the Tudor revival for this case.
hmm yeah, I thought this is another challenging one to throw in because this is the Roos House designed by Bernard Maybeck, who was pretty much the father of the first Bay tradition style. So it's, very Tudor, but it was designed by the guy that originated the first Bay tradition style. So, which way would you go on that? Um, First Bay tradition did incorporate some Tudor elements. I think you could call it both.
And
It's a
I was also going to say that Bernard Maybeck loved Gothic architecture.
True.
Um, so there's some elements of that. He loved this element here. I don't even know what you would call this, Caitlin. Um, but
Like
this is
quatrefoil tracery.
quatrefoil. Yeah, that's why I always asked you those questions. We work together. What do you call this, Caitlin? Um, but he definitely incorporated Gothic elements into his work as well. So this is a hard one.
and this is the last poll question we have. most people are saying Queen Anne.
I think they are right on target. I might even call this Queen Edward because it's a turn of the century example where you're where you have elements, buildings that were Queen Anne. That's exactly the form and shape. But as I point out, that sort of, we don't have any fish scale shingles up in here. We've got flush wood siding. Um, this puts it right on the transition between the two. So Queen Anne or Edwardian, it's right in between the two. Good job.
Yeah, I think if everybody was being graded on this, they would have passed. So, um,
I think so.
I'll move on to the evaluation. I wanted to thank both of our speakers, Jonathan and Caitlin. Thank you both. Amazingly done, and
You're
thanks
welcome.
for keeping us on time for the most part. Um, and I also wanted to thank Pacific Union and all its agents. You've stuck through it, and you're now halfway through the course. Um, Thank you, Lauren Turnauer, for helping support CPF and provide details to agents who need to log in. Um, so you probably recognize this evaluation page. We love to get your feedback. Please fill in the typed in responses on the bottom. And if you do have any additional questions, I know we missed our Q&A period, but just type them in the tell us what topics or why did you want to take this class box, and I'll be sure that the speakers get them and we'll respond to them. When you provide the feedback in the feedback form, you're going to have to scroll all the way back up to the top and hit the submit response button. The submit button is at the top of the page. I know it's counterintuitive, but unfortunately I'm able to fix that. And there are some links on the right hand side. And I will send everybody PDFs of both presentations by the end of the day, along with a recording of the session. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the day. And the next session will be on the 19th of June at 10 a.m., and that will cover city regulations and design guidelines. So have a wonderful day. I'll leave the evaluation page up for about 15-20 minutes.